for change erupted in May of 2020. After George Floyd was murdered during an arrest at 38th and Chicago in Minneapolis.
No, let him keep that like that. You don't let him feel bad about yourself. Go ahead.
Those calls grew in April of 2021 when Dante Wright was killed by an officer in Brooklyn Center.
Nothing is more damaging to police-community relations than the excessive or unnecessary use of force.
So what is the state of policing in Minnesota?
We hope that police will change their practices, they will get more training, and approach protests with more respect for people's First Amendment rights.
Over the next hour, WCCO will take you inside for the first time.
Knees are not on the subject, knees are on the ground.
To see how police are trained.
This topic is one of the biggest topics in policing in America today. When we use force, how we treat people, how we approach situations. And it's the biggest liability.
Listen to community members calling for transparency.
You know, as a minority community, we're afraid to call the police because every time we call the police, one of our community member dies or injured.
This is a nationwide effort, but it takes all of us to do this.
And hear from police chiefs who are at the center of it all.
Problem solving is probably the most important.
Absolutely.
And we train officers to make split-second decisions, but we also need to make sure that they have the ability to slow things down when they can.
Thank you for joining us for this important conversation about the state of policing. I'm Jennifer Merrily. We've heard you asking for transparency when it comes to how police are trained and how they interact with the community, specifically when it comes to use of force. WCCO photojournalist Grant Verdon and I started this project with the goal of giving you an in-depth look at that training, spending months talking with police and hearing from you, the people they serve. We invited the two biggest departments in Minnesota to participate. Minneapolis Police declined our invitation. St. Paul Police said yes. And for the first time, the department authorized unrestricted access to record their quarterly training. The department reports it's reduced use of force by 37%. They credit some of that to a change in training they made in 2015. Going from use of force training to response to resistance or aggression, or RRA training. The department calls it an overhaul. We talked with Chief Todd Axtell before he retired about supporting the move and the progress made.
I am incredibly and deeply honored to serve as your next St. Paul Police Chief.
Todd Axtell says when he became police chief in St. Paul, he knew training needed an update.
We had, more uses of force and more injuries of suspects and officers, and things just weren't working to the standard that we needed at the time.
As he came up the ranks over his 33-year career, he says initially there were 3 steps in using force.
You ask them, you tell them, and then you make them. And it really didn't matter how long it took to get between each of those steps.
He says that was in line with training and policy.
For the decades, our training unit has really found out that officers need scenarios where they can win without laying hands on, where you can talk your way out of a situation, where you can de-escalate successfully.
He knows in certain instances force will be necessary. In those cases, he expects 3 things to be true.
It has to be reasonable, necessary, and done with respect.
What made you say we're going to be at the forefront of changing training and looking at what's needed and what's next?
This topic is one of the biggest topics in policing in America today. When we use force, how we treat people, how we approach situations. And it's the biggest liability. Cities across this country and counties across this country are paying millions upon millions of dollars as a result of unnecessary uses of force.
The highest year payout for St. Paul was 2017 at $2.3 million. It's gone down every year after.
The proof is in the pudding. This is working. It's not just about the money. It's about the trust, the confidence, and the way the people view their police department, not the police department, their police department.
We will begin with just a warm-up.
He says that's part of the strategy behind response to resistance or aggression.
To maintain distance, try to de-escalate them.
A mindset shift, Axtell says, that was originally met with pushback, then acceptance and buy-in.
So we made a commitment. We are going to invest more time and more money into our training unit to make sure that we reduce the likelihood that those things will happen. They will happen. It's not a matter of if, but when. But if you can reduce the number of time, you build trust and you save your city money at the same time.
If you want different performance, then you have to give people the tools to do.
Yeah, depending on level of resistance, it might be enough just to control my hand.
Sergeant Sean Zahar oversees the RRA training program.
We kind of primarily used concepts from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and some wrestling techniques where we could take officers of smaller stature and could use these techniques against people that were a lot larger than them more effectively and using less force overall.
These are the most common areas where officers were either assaulted or force was used.
He walked us through the reasoning behind RRA and says academy training went from 80 hours to 120.
Now our focus is leverage-based control. So using your body weight to physically control somebody, not waiting for the compliance necessarily to get them into custody. So just our ability to control someone effectively and get them in the handcuffs quicker is safer for everyone.
Chemical irritant use is down.
And he shared stats. Sergeant Zahar has his PhD and worked with an outside analyst to look at use of force before and after shifting to RRA.
We had like 37% reduction in force overall. Strikes were down nearly 69% over that 5-year average. Use of the taser, use of our pepper spray were down. And people mostly, when they had to use force, they relied on those empty hand control techniques.
The study shows officers came into contact with more people who aggressively resisted, including a 15% increase in people with weapons.
Here's our classroom portion.
At the same time, other training complemented RRA, like implicit bias, moral courage, and crisis intervention. Zahar says subject injuries went down, so did officer injuries.
We have such a limited amount of time to do training. It has to be beneficial and it has to be impactful.
Squads are still being used.
To stay on top of use of force, there's a weekly review meeting by the command staff. The training unit looks at body-worn camera videos.
We don't need our community to come to us to say something went bad. That's our job.
Axtell says it all adds up to better and safer interactions between police and the community they serve. They're okay showing what they're doing to make improvements.
Every positive interaction we have with the community, every deposit with the media where we can show the work in a transparent way that we're doing is a deposit into that very important bank of trust.
Use of force calls account for 0.2% of the calls in St. Paul. Last year, that was 575 for 240,104 incidents. We've added the use of force study to WCCO.com/links. St. Paul Police gave us full access to record quarterly RRA training. It is a requirement for all officers. Training typically starts with some work in the classroom. Trainers go over law or policy. They might review video of techniques from other departments where things didn't go well, and then they head downstairs to begin. The first stop is here at the locker, so officers can lock up the tools on their belt, like their service weapon and taser. Inside the mat room, they're checked. The officers replace those tools with training handcuffs, a replica handgun that's weighted to mimic the real thing, a taser, and fake pepper spray. Then it's time for training to start.
We will begin with just a warm-up of 2 officers standing handcuffing.
Mat training goes about an hour each quarter.
Make some type of eye contact and move in at the same time here. Sir, you are under arrest.
With each technique, there's a demonstration.
And our goal here is to grab for that upper arm. We'll do this for anyone who is either completely compliant or maybe even a low level of resistance. We're grabbing that upper arm. My lead hand slides down to the wrist, and we guide that hand behind the back. If no questions, let's split up into groups of 3 and get some reps. We're ready to break. The techniques that we use now more rely on what we call soft, empty hand techniques, techniques that are more scalable, we call it. We rely on grappling. Grappling meaning techniques that use timing and leverage, designed for even a smaller officer to overcome even a larger, more aggressive subject.
Trainers offer guidance.
And Commander, you step with your right foot right behind hers. There you go.
And corrections throughout.
So ideally, see how she's got her hand laced through the front? Yep. And then maintain control with this hand right on the wrist. We'll form two lines.
We set up 2 static cameras to capture every angle of training.
Officers, you're covering your head. You're closing that distance.
Plus, photojournalist Grant Verdon rolled on the entire training with a 3rd camera, moving around the room to capture the movements closer up. What you're seeing are the camera shots edited together.
Reset. My favorite thing about the techniques that you saw would be the team techniques. We have used 2-officer handcuffing, our 2-officer takedown, our 2-officer ground kind of control and handcuffing techniques to solve the vast majority of the situations that have arisen on the street in the last few years, where we have a subject who resists us, but we do have those multiple officers on scene. This 2-officer takedown, one of us grabs that rear clinch, the other grabs those legs. We can control the rate of descent of the subject. I'm simply taking a couple steps back, bending at the knee, and allowing the subject's weight to slide down to the ground. We're intentionally putting them on their back. We want them on their back so we can continue to control those hands so that we don't create that situation where they're face down, we can't see hands, they might be accessing weapons. We'll communicate from here. All right, he is down resisting, let's turn him over. Partner comes off those legs. I simply give my partner one of those arms. He pins it right above the subject's head. I pull the other arm low to the ground. We get him turned over. And we get those hands behind the back. Prone handcuffing, super important. Knees are not on the subject. Knees are on the ground. Very important, though, that we have them in contact with the subject's hip and just above the subject's shoulder. It's going to take away that side-to-side wiggle room that the subject has. I'm going to use my arm that's closest to his head and grip the wrist. That elbow drops down in that shoulder crease, right where the tricep meets the upper back there. I can drop that elbow to try to pin that shoulder point to the ground. My other hand grips the wrist, and I tuck my elbow right against my hip. We're going to control those hands behind the back. At this point, we do have them controlled, so we can safely access cuffs. Does not matter which hand I cuff with.
I've seen this since my beginning of my career here in St. Paul. It starts with our academy. In the academy, we get the small details. When we're here, it's just the repetitiveness of it.
Officer Brianna Kitch joined St. Paul Police 4 years ago.
Excellent, very nice.
She says learning these techniques makes her more confident in the field.
For me, being a female and a smaller stature female, these techniques I love to take to the street because I can take down somebody bigger and stronger than me. And I have the confidence of knowing, hey, I can do this without hurting myself and without hurting them as well.
I'm dropping the weapon side elbow down, reaction side elbow up.
The idea behind response to resistance or aggression, or RRA training, is to give officers options when they encounter people on the job, so they don't have to escalate to higher uses of force.
This is about control. Engaging physically, might look rough, but in all actuality, what we're doing are trained tactics that are very safe. And the idea is we're doing them because we don't want to cause injury.
Sergeant David McCabe says he pays attention and knows what he's learning here can make a difference out there.
We might have been smiling or giggling or whatever because, we're with our friends. But in the back of the mind, everybody's picturing, okay, I'm at a bar and there's a bar fight and somebody comes at me. Putting these tactics into context is really what takes it to the next level.
Very nice, Paul.
You did each one for a couple minutes. Is that enough?
That's a great question. There's no doubt that I would not turn down additional training time. We've made it very retainable. Most of the techniques are very simple. Our 2-officer takedown, somebody's grabbing the upper body of the subject and somebody's grabbing the legs of the subject. There's not much to it. Generally, the techniques are very forgiving, meaning if you do forget even 20, 30, 40% of the details, it'll still almost certainly work on the street.
As we mentioned, we set up 3 cameras to capture different angles of training. We edited those cameras together to give you the full look at what we saw. You can watch the raw training video at WCCO.com. Look for this story. The training is complete and nothing has been edited out. We were also there to capture some of the latest Academy class in mid-September. The class of 25 went through scenario training. We're told by the time this happens, the class has learned concepts and the reason behind them, plus basic skills. Then they are put through scenarios, practicing RRA skills, de-escalation, and crisis intervention in a real-time but controlled atmosphere. Several departments have modeled their training after St. Paul's RRA. St. Paul's trainers developed a way to train other agencies in the tactics. So far, more than 140 departments have sent someone to learn RRA. That includes all of these agencies in the past year. We can see how that training played out in real time. St. Paul Police shared dash cam video of RRA training tactics being used during a call in 2020. Police tell us officers responded to a man in possession of a stolen vehicle. You can see two officers approach on either side of the subject. Sergeant Sean Zahar walks us through it.
Attempted two-officer handcuffing didn't work. Two-officer takedown.
The officers are there on the ground with the person. Take a look. You'll notice the same tactic taught in RRA training.
They're just controlling his hands. Got one officer in the mount position. Do a turn over here in a second.
Here's another side-by-side from training. The officers turn the person over from lying on his back to being on his stomach.
Security hands behind his back. You can see they're not on top of him at all. They're on the sides.
They search him and we're told make the arrest. At the heart of all of this, community and how police interact with the people they're supposed to protect and serve. We gathered a group of invested Minnesotans to talk about training, their thoughts on what they saw and what they'd like to see moving forward. Plus, police reform at the state capitol, what's changed and what's still being talked about when we come back. The community has pushed for greater transparency in police training. It's the people who live here who have kept the conversation going and held police departments accountable. And that's why we brought 4 Minnesotans who are invested in this topic together for a robust conversation about use of force training and expectations moving forward. Reverend Ian Bethel with New Beginnings Baptist Ministries serves as chair of Unity Community Mediation Team working with Minneapolis Police. Michelle Gross is president of Communities United Against Police Brutality. Hmong 18 council member Charlie Chang works with Hmong clans in the state. And Rodney Lewis is a Minneapolis native. A family member is an MPD officer. They watched the full St. Paul Police quarterly training video, watching intently, taking notes. We listened to what they had to say about what St. Paul is doing. We talked about what they want to see in police training when it comes to use of force and how they feel about police in general. Here's some of what they had to say. We gathered at WCCO TV in downtown Minneapolis. Let's just start with first reactions after seeing 48 minutes of training.
I would hate to be a police officer, because who am I to come from a community and tell you that you were a professional to do what you had to do? And I would hope that our conversation here is about our accountability as community and not just accountability with police. This is a nationwide effort, but it takes all of us to do this.
This emphasized don't land on that person, stay to their side, and use body mechanics. It was a very sound training, and I liked the emphasis a lot on officer safety as well as the safety of the individual they're dealing with.
Verbally de-escalated them to allow.
Charlie Chang said he felt other departments could learn from St. Paul Police, collaborate to share tactics that could lead to lower injuries. He's gone through their Citizen Academy.
You know, as a minority community, we're afraid to call the police because every time we call the police, one of our community member dies or injured, or so it's very difficult as a minority community to trust the police and see the police as an asset to our community.
It was training. It was training, and it wasn't in the heat of battle. My perspective is, I have a loved one that's a Minneapolis police officer. And I want my loved one to go home at night.
Said that.
Okay?
Yeah.
And also, we need the police because there's people out there that are trying to hurt other people. But the police officers that I know are good people. They're good men and good women. They got a tough job to do.
People have said we made mistakes. I grabbed the wrong gun! But we have been fighting for a long time about these mistakes don't happen. Training is a key piece.
Policing is a physicality. There's a physicality to it. And when you have things that are physical skills that you need to learn, you have to practice them a lot.
What we have to do, seeing this, is to make sure that we equip law enforcement to do their job and to effectively do it, especially in the Black and the Native and the brown communities.
Talk about why we're here today. It's because this has become a national conversation.
That's right.
Police training has been kind of the center or the focus, and everyone seems to have an opinion about what it is, what should happen. Do you want it to be more transparent about how this all works?
Absolutely. Transparency is what builds community trust. Community engagement is what builds community trust. We'd like our police departments to be transparent. We'd like our police department to have community engagement. And we'd like to have our police departments or our officers or whoever be held accountable for, what they've done.
You're a member of a group that has a reputation, but are police able to say, well, this guy's doing this that I don't really agree with? Because we have seen cops that try and stop other cops from doing stuff, they could be shunned.
You have to teach officers how to intervene, and you have to create the culture that makes it okay to intervene. Because the biggest problem is the culture. The biggest problem when it comes to interventions is the culture.
We got to bring George Floyd in there.
He's not responsive right now. You gonna let him keep that like that? You gonna let him feel bad about yourself? Go ahead.
He was a new cop. The other guy was.
They
weren't running the whole situation. So I mean, they was in a tough situation.
But you have to understand what Chief Aradona said. They were complicit.
They were complicit.
And the field training officer, because our conversation here is about training.
It is.
Okay? This is about training.
The field training officers have to mirror the training that's happening in the academy.
But like we know.
They've got to be on board.
I mean, that training was St. Paul.
It sounds like, we come here with this one topic, police training, but it seems like it really is a broader topic. It's community impact, it's culture. We've heard it's the mental health of officers. So it goes far beyond the training.
So training is important, but not all conduct is training. You've got to recruit people, the right people. You've got to, set expectations, hold people accountable for those expectations. Everything isn't all training, but the training helps. It helps you develop that muscle memory where you can behave properly and not just go off your adrenaline gut reaction thing.
What do you think the conversation really should be about then?
Yeah, it should be about the culture of the police department and the community trust that we need to build between the police and the community.
What do you think would make a difference?
That's a tough question, and it's a task as well, because we know the history of policing. And so the history of policing, in my mind, or a lot of people's mind, has been brutality against minority people, people of color. So, I mean, how do you get their trust back? How do you get people of color to trust the police when they've been brutalized for so many years?
To me, I feel like there's culture and transparency. Yes. We have got to address, what you all have been talking about, the culture of the police department. And culture is a top-down phenomenon. It comes from the chief. It comes from the leadership.
Also, we have the community has to deal with our own transparency and also our own consequences, because when you send the police into a situation and our community not coming forth, okay?
But at the same time,
no, there need to be some training.
No, you're right.
There need to be some training in our community too.
I just want to be safe. How about everybody just wanting to be safe? Because just like my man said, people out here, we know people are doing dirty stuff out there. I just want to be safe. I want my mom to be safe. I want my siblings, my loved ones to be safe. We all want to be safe.
We support our police departments, and we need our police departments. But these tragic events that's happened in the last few years has started this conversation, and we slowly would like to see a culture of change in the police department that the community can trust.
Absolutely agree. And I also think this, policing is a hard job. They have taken on all these other roles because we didn't have responders. And now it's our job as a society to both create those expanded response networks and then hold our police accountable for doing their job.
Mentoring with police is so important.
Transparency, training, and engagement.
As important as training.
Yes.
That is training.
And culture.
Yes.
And culture.
Yeah.
As well as consequences.
We thank Reverend Ian Bethel, Michelle Gross, Charlie Chang, and Rodney Lewis for their time and insights into this issue. Some police reform has happened since 2020. The legislature made changes to laws related to use of force, most notably when deadly force can be used. The language in the law changed to say the use of deadly force is only justified if it's to protect officers or another from death or great bodily harm, and they can give the specific reason why they used it. The Police Accountability Act of 2020 included a ban on chokeholds, required a duty to intervene, along with mental health and autism training. Earlier this year, the legislature failed to act on a ban to no-knock warrants, following the police killing of Amir Locke in Minneapolis. Some cities have enacted their own bans. The omnibus public safety bill passed during the special session did include a process to follow when issuing a no-knock warrant and reporting requirements to the Commissioner of Public Safety and to the legislature. Several lawsuits followed the riots of 2020 that resulted in more training for officers. Our cameras were at training earlier this year required for State Patrol troopers and DNR conservation officers about how they interact with the media during civil unrest. It's part of a settlement with the ACLU over alleged mistreatment. More recently, Robbinsdale Police agreed to more training when it comes to how they treat citizens recording them. It stems from a settlement with a woman who taped a traffic stop involving 2 black men. You heard from the community. They think culture and leadership is as important as training. Next, we'll talk with police chiefs from around the state, leaders who for the first time talk candidly about use of force, challenges, and what can make a difference. And later, we'll hear from the regulatory agency over training and standards, how the Post Board is changing to keep up with community demands. Welcome back. We just heard from the community. The group said they think leadership and the culture of a department plays a role in use of force training and outcomes. We brought together police chiefs from around the state for a rare, candid conversation about police training and use of force. St. Paul Police hosted the discussion where we talked about what they're doing in their departments and what they think can help build community trust and deliver better outcomes.
My name is Jeremy Ellison. I'm currently serving as the interim chief of police for the St. Paul Police Department.
My name is Roger Newell, and I'm the chief of police at the Eagan Police Department.
Eric Winter, chief of police for City of Maple Grove.
Scott Borbin with Minnetonka Police.
Dave Bentrud, I'm police chief of the City of Waite Park up by St. Cloud.
Let's start the conversation.
There have been some new mandates that have come down from the Post Board and from the legislature related to, de-escalation and crisis management and diversity and conflict management. So there are a lot of subjects that we try to train our officers on, more so than when I started my career.
For police departments, we all operate under the same state statute and for the most part have identical use of force policies. Mm-hmm. You have to also note that there's hiring and making sure you hire the right people. Mm-hmm. And it really starts with that and making sure that the folks you hire have the ability to problem solve. Problem solving is probably the most important.
Absolutely.
And we train officers to make split-second decisions, but we also need to make sure that they have the ability to slow things down when they can. And then you have the culture of the department, which is a big part of it. Again, we have the same, very similar policies, but what's the culture?
We do quarterly response to resistance and aggression training, which again gets back to that, what's the culture of the organization? And, our goal is not to use force, and we do try to slow things down. And use every tool in the toolbox before we end up putting our hands on somebody, because that's the last thing our cops want to do and the last thing that we as an agency want them to have to do.
Tools in the toolbox. When each of us started our career, those tools look differently. And now more than ever, we have to lean into all things technology and what are the different things that are out there that we're using. Also, one of the things that we're implementing in many departments is drones. It does help us slow down. And it helps us do our job much differently than we did it in the past.
In Maple Grove, we really have 3 pillars.
Chief Warner says it's character, how they interact with people, and initiative.
To take that into the use of force, there are the tactics, there's the technology, there's the equipment,
but how does an officer understand the complexity of a use of force decision? And most importantly, assessing an incident before it happens, trying to slow it down.
You know, we do a psychological assessment, and one of the instruments they use is problem solving. And we want to make sure, again, that's one of the areas that I focus most often, is because I want to make sure the officers, as they evaluate a set of circumstances, things start to change rather quickly. And can they maneuver without maybe overreacting and slow down when they can. If there's a need, in a split second, they try to make the best decision possible for the best outcome. And that's not easy. People are human, and you can't flip switch on and off.
A lot of it has to do with the situation that they're confronted with, and I think communication is one of those things that's key. When we're sitting down interviewing candidates is, do we have people that are good communicators? Because more so now than ever, we need people that are able to communicate to help to escalate situations, but at the same time, be able to turn on the switch too, because some situations can't be resolved by simply talking it through with people. And you do have to use force by simply putting your hands in, taking someone into custody. It's not what we look to do, but that is an inherent part of what we're asked to do as police officers.
How do you define use of force? Because I think so many people have a different definition.
There's a definition, but then there's what the department defines for their accountability systems. So we're guided by state statute on deadly force. We're guided by case law. We're guided by our training, the application of a baton versus a taser versus a firearm versus hands-on. Those are all separate levels of force that we have to train the officers on. I thought the chief brought up a really good point here, is how do we train well, but also how do we document and review so we can learn, and then how do we continue to improve if we need improvement, or reward the behavior that we want to get.
It's a spectrum. I mean, officers do hands-on techniques, muscling techniques we call it, all the way up to deadly force. But anywhere you fall on that spectrum, the force has to be reasonable. It has to be necessary.
I know sometimes use of force doesn't look pretty. How can you explain, or how do you explain that to the community? Because the community will sometimes come up and say, okay, I saw this, and I hear another explanation from police. So can you kind of bridge the two to help people understand what happens when force is used?
Well, I think it is ugly. And I think what is important for the officers, and we see it, and we also see it where it doesn't happen, is that you're evaluating it, and as soon as you have control, you need to assess it. And it may be where you need to render aid. You need to be able to identify that need immediately and then start to render aid.
You look at those incidents that they may be lawful but ugly looking. I think that starts with the perception or the knowledge that our communities have on how much force do we really use. Unfortunately, the ones that don't look very well are the ones that get a lot of media attention, and that's where we just have to continue to work with our communities to do that outreach and education.
Chief Warner's point of community outreach and to educate the public is really key, because I think that the public doesn't necessarily fully understand when force is applied, how it's applied, and what leads into an officer making that decision. So, it becomes important for our agencies to make sure that they connect with the community to educate them so they're aware of, what those situations are. That is one of the challenges that we face in law enforcement. Some of the things that, perception or beliefs that people have that officers should be able to do, I can tell you it's unrealistic, some of the things that people, ask police officers to do with resolving situations. And that's the part where, you got to humanize and make people understand these are challenging jobs, and we're asked to go into challenging situations and encounter some dangerous situations. And how do you navigate that? That is, again, the challenge. Each and every day you go and put on the uniform.
Are there situations where that slowing things down doesn't work? Maybe you don't have the chance to de-escalate.
I think Chief of St. Paul's got a traffic stop.
Perfect incident comes to mind where we had an officer a couple years ago that was rear-ended by a person in crisis, most likely. As soon as the car crashed into this officer, he then got out of the car and started attacking the officer with an edged weapon. And the officer was trying to de-escalate by creating distance, giving commands, trying to slow things down. Get away from me! Drop the knife! This person was so intent on doing harm to the officer The officer at one point was on his back and just trying to get away and trying to create distance. And unfortunately, there was nothing more that officer could do, and was forced into a situation where he had to react and use deadly force.
Shots fired! Shots fired!
It's really tricky. I mean, you officers have to make some decisions sometime about when are they going to go put hands on or put somebody under control.
You look at an officer, they don't have superpowers.
Right.
And you look at the nation and you take Uvalde and the lack of initiative to go in and address that, and you see the outcome. And in the same breath, you want to make sure that they do slow it down, but recognize when they need to resolve the issue in hand. And that's not easy for a person to process.
Are we building in our officers some degree of hesitation? Where are they recognizing the situation for what it is? And so we're talking about de-escalating, we're talking about slowing things down, but I would submit there's a point for the welfare of the person as well as the officer that action needs to be taken sooner rather than later. And that is a difficult needle to thread.
Sometimes it's not clear when you should or shouldn't go. And that becomes the biggest challenge. When's the right time and when's the wrong time? And we can sit and scrutinize those officers in Uvalde, but at the same time, when you listen to what the public's expectation of law enforcement is which is slowing down, it creates that challenge. Do we or don't we? Now, that said, I will clearly say, the officer should have went in Uvalde, but that provides this context of, really looking at law enforcement right now and hearing what the public is saying, and when we use, the phrase "slow down," in what situation, and I don't know that you could rubber stamp and say every situation requires that.
They say tools, technology, and training is constantly evolving.
So we track every use of force encounter. Like St. Paul mentioned, they review it. Our sergeants review the body cam footage. They send it to the next layer. They review and make sure we're in line. And if we have a person who is maybe not aligned with our vision, we need to deal with it. I think the public should also know that too. We're not here to tell the public this is why we do it. It's also to say we hold our folks accountable, and we should.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for being part of the conversation.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
The chiefs say there is a renewed emphasis on taking care of officers. Some departments make it mandatory to get a checkup from the neck up to see a therapist. They say when the officer's mental health is better, the response is better. We checked with the chiefs we talked with on their use of force numbers and officer conduct payouts. Use of force accounted for less than 1% of total calls over the last 5 years for all departments. Waite Park, Minnetonka, and Maple Grove had no payouts in that time frame. Eagan Police paid $75,000 in 2017. Still ahead, we'll take a look at the state of police training in Minnesota and where it stands today. We sit down with the board who oversees training and standards. Hear where the chair says they need to be more consistent next. The state licensing board for officers in Minnesota came under fire after the police killing of George Floyd. The executive director of the Peace Officers Standards and Training Board called it a watershed moment. The post board sets licensing and training requirements across the state and updates them based on state law. We learned about changes made and what's still to come.
As the board is contemplating.
Minnesota's Post Board meets 4 times a year, made up of community members, those in higher education, and law enforcement, all appointed by the governor.
I will look for a motion.
Mendota Heights Police Chief Kelly McCarthy is the chair.
That is one of the challenges of a statewide board, is how do you make policy, how do you make rules that give as much local autonomy as possible to the communities, but maintain a statewide standard.
McCarthy came into the role in 2019, months before the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and testified about training standards during the federal trial of 3 ex-MPD officers. Now she's open and getting uncomfortable while talking about where the state of training is in Minnesota.
This is going to seem really counterintuitive. We have some of the best trained officers when you look at use of force. We have so many contacts every day that are violent in nature that Minnesota officers de-escalate. I think why we are having this conversation now is we're not consistent. And we're certainly not consistent when it comes to people who look different from us or from people who come from different backgrounds for us. So if you're a person of color in Minnesota, you're seeing police officers, you're seeing videos of cops de-escalating situations where they're getting hit in the head with hammers, and yet you're seeing police officers unable or moving to a higher level of force with people that don't look like that officer. And so that's the really difficult conversation to have, and it's scary. It's scary to have. It's certainly scary to have on a statewide level because it gets to a lot of societal things, so it's much easier just to say, train them better.
McCarthy believes even with standards of training, it only goes so far.
Not all training is quality training. And even if you do have quality training, not everybody takes away the same thing. You have all those variables, and then you're responding to somebody who's in crisis or potentially violent, and most likely armed. If it was simple, we would have solved it.
So how to become more consistent? Because you said we're good, but we're not consistent.
I think we've started by bringing in the focus on crisis intervention, by bringing in quality equity training, emphasis on the quality, where we give everybody an opportunity to really reflect on what are those biases that you come to the profession with, that you may come to different calls with.
For the first time, the Post Board is taking a full look at its responsibilities.
We are looking at every function that the Post Board does, from who is eligible to be a police officer, to standards of conduct, to training, to model policies.
Any stasis that was the case for many years with the Post Board is gone.
It's going to be busy.
Eric Misselt is on staff as the executive director.
Somewhere along the lines, the expectations for the policing profession have changed. By consequence, the expectations of the Post Board have changed, and now we are getting up to speed.
He says right now they're going through rulemaking, looking at what needs to change, along with a discussion with stakeholders about what its role should be.
We can offer training, we can put policies in place, and do all of the things that we should be doing, and yet these incidents may still happen, and it may come down to a particular agency or how they carry out their mission, and figuring out where the Post Board fits in to that scenario is, again, the crux of the argument that's going on right now.
The board and staff say they want to be part of the solution, and that's what they're working toward.
It's going to take all of us to figure out how we get better. I have a lot of confidence, and I have the optimism of a toddler, and I know that. But these are conversations we would have never had 5 years ago, 2 years ago.
Last month, the Post Board rolled out a way to search peace officer licenses online. It will show if the board has taken any disciplinary action against an officer. Right now, it can only take action after a conviction. The board wants to be able to act on a license if an officer violates the standard of conduct, whether there's been a conviction or not. We have a link to the public portal and proposed rule changes at WCCO.com. There, you'll also find a link to the first ever Post Board audit done in 2020. Still ahead, St. Paul has named its next police chief. What the commander selected to lead the department says about RRA training and if he'll continue what the previous administration started. St. Paul has a new police chief. The city council voted on the mayor's pick. Melvin Carter nominated Commander Axel Henry earlier this month. Henry has 24 years of experience in law enforcement. He joined St. Paul Police in '98 after starting with Roseville Police. He's gone through the quarterly response to resistance or aggression training and says he's seen the progression over the past few years. And he supports continuing RRA training in the department.
We've always been very progressive in that and tried to get better and better, and the latest and our most current iteration is the evolution of everything that we've learned, and so it's something that we always have to look at and always make sure that we're doing the best possible version of that for our community and for our officers.
He hopes other departments in the state and around the country will use their training as a model. Henry will begin his 6-year term this weekend. For another look at St. Paul's RRA training, head to WCCO.com. We've added the raw video there. And as we've mentioned, we set up 3 cameras to capture different angles of training. We edited those cameras together to give you the full look at what we saw. Thank you for being part of this conversation. We hope you found value in what you heard. We'd like to thank St. Paul Police for working with us on this project,
lowering and grabbing legs,
and allowing us to show you how they train.
We're more safe, it's more effective, we get people into custody, we treat them with dignity and respect.
We appreciate the community members for sharing their views.
Transparency is what builds community trust. Community engagement is what builds community trust.
To me, I feel like there's culture and transparency. Yes. You know, we have got to address, you know, what you all have all been talking about, the culture of the police department. And culture is a top-down phenomenon.
Police chiefs for weighing in on this important topic.
We have the same, very similar policies, but what's the culture?
And the Post Board for sharing the changes it's making.
It's going to take all of us to figure out how we get better.
And lastly, thank you for joining us. More local news continues on CBS News Minnesota next.